Right now, somewhere out there, someone is opening a budgeting app for the third time this year, telling themselves this time it's actually going to stick. Maybe it's you. Maybe you've downloaded the app, set up the categories, watched a YouTube video exactly like this one about how to get your finances under control, felt genuinely motivated for about 2 weeks, and then slowly, quietly, stopped checking it altogether. A few months later, you find it again, deleted, forgotten, and you tell yourself the same story you told yourself the last time. I just don't have the discipline for this. Here's what I want you to actually sit with before we go any further. That story you're telling yourself is almost certainly wrong, and not in a vague, feel-good, everything happens for a reason kind of way. It's wrong in a specific, well-documented, psychologically predictable way that has almost nothing to do with your character and everything to do with how budgeting systems are typically designed in the first place. My name is COLT, and today we're going to take apart exactly why budgets fail so consistently for so many people, including people who are genuinely intelligent, genuinely motivated, and genuinely want to get their financial life under control. If you've ever started a budget with real enthusiasm and watched that enthusiasm completely evaporate within a few weeks, I need you to actually stick around for this entire video, because what we're about to cover might be the single most important reframe you ever hear about personal finance. Subscribe and hit that like button if any part of this sounds painfully familiar. Let's start with the actual data, because this isn't a minor or occasional problem. Research and surveys on budgeting behavior consistently show that a substantial majority of people who start a new budget abandon it within the first few months, with many studies suggesting somewhere between 60 and 80% of people who attempt budgeting eventually stop maintaining it altogether, often within 90 days. This isn't a small minority struggling with an otherwise effective system. This is the overwhelming majority outcome, which should immediately make you suspicious that the problem lies somewhere in the system itself, rather than in some widespread, mysterious personal failing shared by the vast majority of the population. So if it's not discipline, what's actually going on? Let's build this up piece by piece, starting with the most fundamental misunderstanding almost every traditional budgeting approach is built on. The first problem is something behavioral economists and psychologists call willpower depletion, sometimes referred to as ego depletion in academic research. The basic finding behind this concept, replicated across numerous studies over the years, is that willpower behaves less like a fixed personality trait and more like a finite, exhaustible resource, similar to physical energy. Every time you resist a temptation, make a difficult decision, or force yourself to do something your brain would rather avoid, you draw down on a limited daily reserve of mental energy. This reserve doesn't regenerate instantly. It depletes throughout the day, and it requires rest, sleep, and recovery to fully replenish. Here's why this matters enormously for budgeting specifically. A traditional restrictive budget asks you to make dozens, sometimes hundreds, of small willpower-demanding decisions every single day. Should I buy this coffee or not? Should I order delivery or cook at home again? Should I buy the cheaper option or the one I actually want? Each of these tiny decisions draws on the exact same limited willpower reserve you're also using throughout your day at work, in your relationships, managing your general stress levels, and handling whatever life happens to throw at you on any given day. By evening, after a long day of work-related decisions, social obligations, and ordinary life stress, your willpower reserve is frequently running dangerously low, at exactly the moment many people make their most significant discretionary spending decisions: ordering dinner, online shopping while relaxing, deciding whether to skip the gym and grab takeout instead. Traditional budgeting essentially asks you to perform your most difficult willpower-demanding task precisely when you have the least willpower available to actually execute it successfully. This explains a pattern almost everyone who's tried budgeting will immediately recognize. Budgets tend to work reasonably well for the first several days, when motivation and willpower reserves are still relatively fresh and novel. Then, as ordinary life stress accumulates, work deadlines, family obligations, simple exhaustion, the willpower required to maintain strict budgeting discipline becomes harder and harder to access, not because the person has become lazier or less committed, but because they're now drawing on the exact same depleted resource for every other demanding decision in their life as well. The second major problem with traditional budgeting is what we might call the restriction rebound effect. And this one has a particularly fascinating parallel in research on dieting, which turns out to be psychologically almost identical to budgeting in many important ways. Decades of research on dietary restriction consistently show that overly restrictive diets, ones that completely eliminate entire categories of food or demand extremely strict daily limits, tend to produce a predictable rebound pattern: initial compliance, followed by escalating psychological pressure and feelings of deprivation, followed eventually by a significant binge or complete abandonment of the restriction altogether, frequently resulting in someone ending up in a worse position than before they started. Budgeting frequently follows this exact same pattern, just measured in dollars instead of calories. Someone creates a budget with categories that feel reasonable on paper, but are actually quite restrictive compared to their previous unstructured spending habits. The first week or two feels manageable, even motivating, but the psychological experience of constant restriction and constant deprivation begins accumulating pressure beneath the surface, the same way dietary restriction does. Eventually, often triggered by a stressful day, a social event, or simply accumulated fatigue from the ongoing restriction, that pressure releases in the form of a significant spending binge, an expensive impulse purchase, an unplanned shopping trip, sometimes resulting in spending that actually exceeds what someone would have spent under a less restrictive approach in the first place. And here's the genuinely cruel part of this pattern, the part that explains why people blame their own discipline rather than the system itself. After the binge, the typical response isn't to question whether the budget itself was too restrictive to begin with. It's almost always to conclude, personally, I clearly don't have the discipline for this, and either abandon budgeting altogether or attempt an even more restrictive version next time, which simply sets up the exact same rebound cycle to repeat itself, often with even greater intensity. The third problem, and this one is more subtle but genuinely important, involves what psychologists call the planning fallacy combined with present bias. When people create a budget, they're essentially making a series of detailed predictions about their future behavior: how much they'll spend on groceries, entertainment, transportation, miscellaneous expenses, weeks or months into the future. The problem is that humans are demonstrably poor at accurately predicting their own future behavior, particularly regarding discretionary spending, because in the moment of actually creating the budget, we're in a calm, rational, forward-thinking state of mind. We're not accounting for the emotional, stressed, exhausted, or socially pressured states we'll actually be in when the real spending decisions eventually occur. This creates budgets that look perfectly reasonable on paper, but were essentially designed by a version of yourself that doesn't actually exist in the moments where real spending decisions get made. The calm, rational budget planning you, sitting quietly with a spreadsheet on a Sunday afternoon, and the stressed, tired, socially influenced you, standing in line ordering dinner after an exhausting day, are functionally very different decision makers, even though they're technically the same person. So given all of this, what actually works? Because understanding why traditional budgeting fails is only useful if it leads somewhere productive. The first major shift is moving away from restriction-based budgeting entirely and toward what's sometimes called a values-based or priority-based spending system. Instead of trying to restrict every single spending category through sheer daily willpower, this approach starts by identifying the handful of things that genuinely matter most to you, then automatically directing money toward those priorities first, before discretionary spending decisions even enter the picture. This dramatically reduces the number of willpower-demanding decisions you need to make on a daily basis, because the most important financial decisions have already been made in advance, during a calm planning moment. rather than requiring ongoing daily willpower to maintain. The second major shift is building in deliberate flexibility rather than rigid restriction, specifically to avoid the restriction rebound effect we discussed earlier. This often means intentionally budgeting a reasonable amount for genuinely enjoyable discretionary spending, rather than attempting to eliminate it entirely. Counterintuitively, building in permission for some guilt-free spending tends to produce significantly better long-term adherence than attempting total restriction. The same way moderate, sustainable approaches tend to outperform extremely restrictive diets over the long term, even though restrictive approaches sometimes look more impressive on paper in the short term. The third major shift is automating as many financial decisions as possible, removing them from the daily willpower equation entirely. This is the same principle we covered in our payday routine video, but it's worth emphasizing again, specifically in the context of why this solves the willpower depletion problem. When savings, investments, and bill payments happen automatically the moment income arrives, before any conscious daily decision-making is required, you've essentially removed the most important financial behaviors from the willpower depletion problem altogether. Your evening, depleted willpower self never actually gets the opportunity to undermine those decisions, because they've already happened automatically, independent of how much willpower you happen to have available on any given day. The fourth major shift involves deliberately designing your environment to reduce the number of willpower-demanding decisions you face in the first place, rather than relying purely on willpower to resist temptation once it's already in front of you. This might mean removing saved payment information from shopping apps to add friction to impulse purchases. This might mean meal planning in advance, specifically to reduce the number of in-the-moment, depleted willpower decisions about food. This might mean unsubscribing from retail marketing emails that are specifically designed to trigger impulse spending at exactly the moments you're most psychologically vulnerable to them. The goal isn't becoming someone with superhuman willpower. The goal is reducing how often you need to rely on willpower at all. The fifth major shift is fundamentally changing how you respond to an inevitable budgeting slip, because slips will happen, and how you respond to them often determines whether the entire system survives or collapses entirely. The restriction rebound research is clear that the people who successfully maintain long-term behavior change aren't the ones who never slip. They're the ones who don't treat a single slip as evidence that the entire system has failed, and therefore something can simply be abandoned. Building in a predetermined plan for handling slips without spiraling into complete abandonment is a more sophisticated and more effective approach than expecting yourself to maintain perfect, unwavering discipline indefinitely. Let me bring this together with a practical example of what this actually looks like when fully implemented. Instead of a traditional budget with 12 restrictive spending categories that all compete for your limited daily willpower, imagine a system where, the moment your paycheck arrives, a predetermined percentage automatically moves to investments, a predetermined percentage automatically moves to savings goals, and your essential fixed expenses are paid automatically as well. What remains afterward is genuinely, guilt-free, flexible spending money. Money you're explicitly allowed to enjoy without tracking every single dollar against a restrictive category, because the financially important decisions have already been made automatically, before any daily willpower was required at all. This approach dramatically reduces daily decision fatigue, builds in genuine flexibility to avoid the restriction rebound effect, and ensures that your most important financial priorities happen regardless of how much willpower you happen to have on any specific day, rather than depending entirely on consistent daily discipline that, as we've discussed, is genuinely difficult for almost anyone to sustain indefinitely. Here's the deeper insight I want you to walk away with today. The widespread failure of traditional budgeting isn't evidence of widespread personal weakness. It's evidence of a systematic design flaw present in how most people are taught to approach budgeting in the first place. One that ignores well-established psychological research about how willpower, restriction, and decision-making actually function in real human beings living real, complicated lives. The solution was never to simply try harder or develop more discipline. The solution is building a system specifically designed to require less discipline in the first place. By automating critical decisions, building in genuine flexibility, and removing as many daily willpower demands as possible. If your budget has failed before, multiple times, this isn't a reflection of some personal character flaw. It's a completely predictable outcome of a system that was never actually designed with how human psychology genuinely works in mind. The path forward isn't more willpower. It's a fundamentally better system. If this changed how you think about why your previous budgets haven't stuck, subscribe, because we break down exactly this kind of thing every single week. And if you know someone who's currently blaming themselves for a budget that simply wasn't designed to work in the first place, send them this video. Sometimes understanding why something failed is the first real step toward building something that actually lasts.